I'm joined today by Darth Putin, master strategist. Now, not all of you will be aware of his fantastic and highly ironic and satirical comments, images, memes, etc. on X, and the two fantastic books, which actually I have on my shelf right here. But we'll put links to those in the description. I strongly recommend that you engage with them because this is fantastic stuff. But it really does undermine all of the Kremlin's propaganda narratives, and it undermines the narratives which are used by Kremlin assets, agents, and useful idiots as well. Darth, this is not your real name, and this is not the first time you've been on Silicon Curtain.
No, it's not. I think you were the second interview I ever did. We spoke a bit over a year ago now, and yeah, it was a really interesting chat. So thank you for having me back on.
It's an absolute delight. No, it's an absolute pleasure, and I had a lot of fun with that thumbnail, as viewers can see here. I've had a lot of fun creating the thumbnail for this one as well. But we are pretty much a year and a half, I think, on from our last conversation. We're into the fourth year of the war, fourth year of doing this podcast, which...
Everything's going to plan, by the way. Just
everything is... Yes, Darth has a plan, and it's all, don't worry, because he knows what he's doing. That's one of the things that I thought wasn't going to work anymore when it came to Russians internally. It's a key plank of Russian internal propaganda, which is, you may not understand it, but we have a plan. It's a good one. I'm a master strategist. You just carry on doing what you do and just leave politics in our hands because we know what we're doing. That I thought was going to be the first one to go, given that we are now beyond 1 million casualties for very little gain, and having burnt through the sovereign wealth fund, not got their sovereign assets back, central bank assets back, having burned through almost their entire stock of Soviet-era munitions and relying on North Korea, I thought the domestic Russian audience would be like, hang on a second, this guy doesn't have a freaking clue, does he? Alas, it seems not. That one still seems to be holding amongst a substantial number of people. Do you have any explanation for that?
Two, and I reserve the right to be wrong. I think the casualties are explained away because the average Russian doesn't care because they're not being forced themselves to go. The people who did go signed for lots of money. And as of yet, there isn't any widespread belief that a lot of them aren't getting the money. They maybe get the sign-on bonus, but the death bonuses are probably not being paid. And that hasn't got around yet because they're just writing them off as missing or deserted or whatever. And the officers involved probably have some kind of scheme where it gets divided upwards depending on your station in the system. And that hasn't come through. So the casualties don't seem to affect the ordinary Russians due to a kind of societal nihilism. When it comes to the sovereign welfare fund, I don't think most of them the average Russian can honestly appreciate what that means to them personally. They probably never thought they were going to see any of it anyway. So I don't think that they really care about that. Even the ones who might know about it. And as for the loss of prestige of having to be relying on China and North Korea, I'm not sure they even know about it yet. They probably aren't really aware that 40% of the ammunition is coming from North Korea because they're all working. A lot of people are working in jobs for a lot more money than they would have got making those very same ammunition stockpiles, albeit not enough to prosecute the war without North Korean assistance. So they probably don't know. That would be my understanding.
And those that do know or have a suspicion, I mean, repression has ramped up significantly, and I think there's almost like a self-censoring mechanism going on here. Regime propaganda, I don't know if you've seen a shift in this, but certainly when it came to suppressing dissent in Belarus, which at some point was certainly far more intense than anything we've seen in Russia, at some point they flipped to not trying to convince people that the regime was good or better or that things would be better under the regime. They flipped to actually a successful strategy of saying, well, okay, we're the bad guys and things are going to be terrible, but you won't win. You won't win because there aren't enough of you, because you are divided, and because we can selectively take you off the streets and torture you. So we've moved from, we're the good guys to we're the bad guys. You better just sort of, knuckle down. Do you think Russia's shifted into such a gear as well?
Yeah, I think so. There's I can't remember the exact Solzhenitsyn quote where he says, "We know that they know, and they know that we know," and so on, so on it goes. And Russia might be somewhere between a third and a halfway through that quote right now. But the average, the number of people who are claiming I'm not political when asked about this has probably gone up, because they know the consequences of speaking out. And a mass display of opposition to this is possibly only likely when people are personally affected by it, i.e. there's not enough food on the shelves.
They'll oppose when the regime is already partially toppling by itself.
I think that might be the case. Most of the generals that flipped against Hitler, for instance, did so after the war was already obviously lost. And as long as they thought they were winning, they didn't. They might not have liked him. They might have thought him to be a thuggish moron and an incompetent, failed corporal artist. But they went with him while he was winning. It might become a little bit harder for the regime when they can no longer report that they've captured some village somewhere each day, or they've advanced each day, and that it becomes impossible to say that. They'll probably keep lying about it for a while, but when it becomes impossible to contain the truth that they're now heading back east, if that happens, then I think the regime will be under a lot more pressure.
And do you notice any shift? Because you're looking at this stuff every single day, trying to find humorous angles on it, trying to actually look at Russia's strategic and propagandistic positioning and find the absurdity in it. So have you noticed a sort of shift in the foreign-oriented propaganda, that which is targeted towards the West in 2025?
Yeah, they're not saying that they're out protecting Russian speakers anymore. That one doesn't really wash, because there's been too many atrocities and too many towns, villages completely erased off the map for that to have any traction. There are still occasionally the odd statement to that effect, but it's a harder one to sustain when people are reading about hospitals being bombed all the time. Occasionally someone will wheel out a trope that it was a false flag, but again, that's harder to sustain, because why would the Ukrainians carry on making false flags 4 years into a war when they've been told as often as they have been that the Americans aren't going to come running over the hill to rescue them? Why would they do that? There's no point. So I think it's shifted more to the fact that they're trying to defend themselves against an aggressive West that it seems intent on breaking them up, or that they were forced into doing this. And all Ukraine has to do is be reasonable and give Russia everything it wants, and that'll be a nice compromise. A lot of people don't. I wouldn't, just to pick up on another thing you said, I don't think Darth actually tries to be funny. Sometimes it's unintentionally funny and it's absurd, but Darth kind of does two things. One is translates what it means when people say Ukraine should just surrender. And there are different ways of doing that. Or you can just point out the gap between what Russia has claimed and what Russia has done. So occasionally, for instance, when someone points out that, well, Ukraine was killing Russians in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass for years, you just show them a picture of what Russia did to protect them, and it's pretty obviously absurd. So that's it. So I try to be very careful about not making light of it and not seeing this as something funny, because it's not. But when you point out that they're defending Christian values by murdering children in their bed, that's not funny, but it is true. And
I guess you don't have to. I mean, there's certainly hard work to be done there in finding the right words and the right structure to convey what's going on. But to an extent, you don't have to work that hard, do you, in order to find the absurdity, because that absurdity is almost inherent in the strategy, inherent in what Russia is saying and what Russia is doing. So is it more about just sort of, massaging the reality slightly to bring out that absurdity?
Yeah, you could call it. I've described it as misworded Kremlinese in the past, where you give a statement that's 90% of what they actually have said, and then you alter it ever so slightly, and it actually reveals a sort of subversive truth. Or you can just point out that the invasion is going. Russia is winning so well that it controls, far less of Ukraine now than it did 3.5 years ago. I just got blocked by some. I don't remember the guy's name, but it was some British guy that was saying that Ukraine's only option is to give Russia what it wants. That's just completely absurd. First of all, you don't understand what Russia wants, which is why Ukraine will never give it to them, because it means 20% of their population will be deported, killed, and worse. And secondly, you aren't aware that what Russia wants. But then the other part of it is if Russia's this great unbeatable power, let's just ignore everything that happened to various nuclear powers in the Cold War years, where many of them lost wars against non-nuclear countries. Russia has lost its entire Black Sea fleet, and this whole strategy that Margareta Simonyan pointed out in the summer of 2022, all of our hope is in famine. That's gone. The Ukrainians broke the naval blockade and sunk almost all of their ships, certainly their capital ship, a submarine, a bunch of other ships too. They've had 1 million casualties and control less territory than they used to. They've had however many strategic retreats. And 2 months ago, they lost 1/3 of their strategic bomber force in a morning to a country that doesn't have an air force. Why would anybody think the Ukrainians would look at all this and think we're going to surrender?
Why would anyone look at that and think, do you know what, the Russians, they can really win this?
Yeah.
But that's been the open question throughout, which is, how does this end? How can Russia win? Can it win? And if it can't win, then what on earth is it doing?
Yeah, I think just when you mention that, there's one more comment that I would think that their propaganda has shifted to, which is that Russia is this remorseless, grinding thing that will destroy and eat and kill everything in its path, and it cannot be defeated. So you have to negotiate now, because you're only going to be negotiating from a worse position in 6 months if you don't give them what they want. And that I think in Western minds, as well as those occupying the Kremlin, is based on this flawed assumption. The Kremlin think that eventually the West will force Ukraine into doing something, to giving them something that's palatable to Russia, which ultimately means Ukraine won't be able to defend itself when Russia attacks it again. And the Kremlin think that, Putin thinks that, because he thinks that the West understands that Ukraine will always be more important to Putin than it is to the West. And the West, those people that subscribe to this theory that Russia will eventually win just because of the size of the country, without knowing anything about what the country is, they think that we have to make Ukraine surrender, because there's no point in Ukraine fighting, because it'll always be more important to Russia than it is to us. But nobody stops and thinks, well, it's going to be more important to the Ukrainians still, and that they actually have a vote and quite a lot of capability to defend themselves and to keep fighting. And that never seems to enter any particular political discussion that informs strategy. So that their propaganda has very much shifted towards, okay, we're losing astonishing numbers of men. We don't care. We fought the Swedish for 20 years in the Great Northern War, and we still won. The difference, of course, is that in the Great Northern War, Russia was led by a very tall, very talented military man, Peter the Great, whereas now it's led by a mad, short, backward dwarf with no military experience whatsoever. So I wouldn't, if I was the Russians, be pulling that particular analogy too much. But your question about what is the Russian strategy, I can't see one. That's not to say I can see a Western strategy either. But Putin's strategy seems to be, well, a series of tactical attacks that will keep the war going in the hope that something turns up.
And this is a fascinating thing here, which again is little discussed, which is we always focus on Putin's, I would say, lack of military expertise, which of course he has none. And he's made blunder after blunder, and many of Russia's assaults and campaigns can be seen to be politically driven, not militarily driven. Hence, they haven't sort of delivered a breakthrough or success. But Putin is a master at manipulation. He is a master at lying. He is a master of deception and organizing resources for industrial scale deception. And this is one of the problems, isn't it? Is that what you've got is a masterful lie machine that is just effective at deluding itself and even manipulating itself than it is at the external audience. That is almost a recipe for this war to carry on, because unlike a more, let's say, economically rational leader that was less expert at spinning this sort of subterfuge, at some point they would have to face reality and say, okay, the game's up, right? Regime survival now depends on withdrawing from this in the least damaging way possible, or freezing the lines of contact and spinning it that way. But it seems that Putin still believes he can spin this reality into some kind of victory. He can sort of manipulate and warp truth and facts to bend towards the sort of the event horizon of the Kremlin. This seems to me that indicates he's on a path to almost inevitable doom, because there's only one way forward, and that is escalate, escalate, and escalate. There's no reverse gear here.
Yeah, Lenin was quoted as saying facts are stubborn things, and Putin will eventually find that out, I believe. And yeah, he is a very good liar, and he's benefited from a lot of Western leaders over the years, over the 25 years he sat on the throne, who were prepared to believe his lies for their own naive political reasons and profit-driven reasons at the time. How it ends, what his situation is, I think he's probably, he does seem to think that he is going to win, and that he's always managed to extract some kind of concession or a pause in the sanctions or something, a pause in the aid, which has allowed him to continue prosecuting the war in a way that isn't going to be too painful for him. Whether that continues or not is open to question, but he will eventually face a reckoning, I think, where I suspect that one likely outcome of this will be the inability to continue offering the types of sign-on bonuses that they are able to offer, and then there are a number of permutations that could come to pass. Some kind of destabilization within Russia itself. Ramzan Kadyrov is rumored to be rather unwell. If he dies
on his last legs, there's a few memes that will no doubt launch.
Yeah, and if they're unable to have a smooth secession plan in Chechnya, then that potentially creates a military problem that the Russian military is currently, in its current deployment pattern, unable to deal with, I would think. There's the possibility of some kind of popular discontent with the war if the rumors become true or not that they're planning on seizing private savings, and that would certainly be politically unpalatable. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be something they're going to do. People could just believe they're going to do it and start taking all their money out of the banks, which would present a lot of Russian banks with liquidity problems. I had a guest on my channel talking about how the Russian bond market is effectively a Ponzi scheme, and they're just kicking that can down the road. So I'm not suggesting it's going to happen soon. I don't even know if it will happen, but eventually these facts, he's almost become in some ways more Stalinist or Bolshevik than his forefathers, who seemed to think that economics could be just bent to political will, and the result would be mass famine or something. And he seems to think that the very nature of reality can be bent to political will as well as economics. So I don't know quite what form it's going to take, but unless something fundamentally changes on the battlefield, where the Russian military figures out some kind of way of avoiding being droned to pieces while they mass some kind of concentration of armor, which they probably don't have anymore, and then making a breakthrough through the front lines and then exploiting it with logistics they don't currently have, to see something politically significant to change the calculus in both Kyiv and in its western backers' minds. All we're talking about now is how long it's going to take and how many people have to be killed before these facts, which are stubborn, will eventually come home to present themselves.
It seems, I mean, I came up with this idea, unfortunately, in the first year of the war, and that seems that this is a race to see who will collapse last, not necessarily who will be victorious. I guess that is the very definition of an attritional war, in fact. But it's held true. It may have been very different with Western resolve. It may have been very different if China hadn't gone all in to support Russia. It may have been different if, let's say, India, Turkey, and others, including the European Union that continued to buy, Russian gas, had something more resembling a sort of a moral, economic, and foreign policy. But none of these things have held, and it only seems now in the fourth year of war that the tide is turning a little bit, and that is perhaps coming from the most unexpected quarter, and that is the change of tone by Trump, but also some actions that are starting to indicate a move to wanting the conflict to end by putting pressure on those that are supporting Russia's war machine, namely India, possibly Turkey, and China as well. And true to form, it seems that the European Union and Britain are only following with similar tough measures when they see the change in tone by Washington. I mean, is that overly harsh or simplistic, or are you detecting a sort of change in narrative and perhaps action?
Well, firstly, I wouldn't. It can be argued that this is an attritional war. It is an attritional war for Russia, but it's a survival war for Ukraine, and that's something very different. And it's a war that Putin himself can't personally stop and survive, but it's a war that Russia could stop and survive and probably benefit from. And that, I think, is a fundamental difference, and informs a lot of what Kyiv's actions are. As for the changes that I'm observing, I'm starting to see that I think that the not the collapse, but the weakening of the Russian ability to wage war through economics will be one of the deciding factors, and we're not at that stage yet. But I think it's quite likely that if Trump's actions are consistent, then that will be accelerated. And I think there's growing signs. I'm picking up a lot more signs from people well informed on the matter that Russia's economy is extremely sick, and that they are in the middle of what we would describe as quite a severe economic crisis, and it hasn't got as bad as it's going to get. There is a conflict within the Russian finance world between the kind of statists who just want to make Russia a war economy and the technocrats who understand economics that recognize the consequences of the situation they're in. And at the moment, the statists seem to be winning, and that's probably a bad thing in the long run for Russia. And that the revenue that they're getting through raising bonds, selling bonds, and then the payouts that they're making are starting to diverge from where they need to be, and that they're consistently getting less money than they need every month to keep the country running, by which I mean paying pensions and state employee salaries, all that sort of stuff, and that eventually that will kind of force a reckoning. whether he's able to just kind of get around that by selling bits of Russia off to China or not, I don't know. And whether he'll be able to raise the money for that, I don't know. But I'm starting to pick up those kind of terms, those kind of narratives and discussions, along with the fact that their summer offensive, their fourth summer offensive, has failed to achieve any of the strategic objectives that were set in 2022. He's given the army 4 deadlines to capture all of the 4 regions that they don't entirely control, and they still haven't.
And they won't. I mean, I think it's extremely unlikely from what I've seen that there's really any chance that they'll make substantial gains on the battlefield. They just don't have the numbers, the mass, and the techniques to do that. Despite some of the systemic problems in the Ukrainian army and the problem with numbers, it's again, we're back to who crumbles first. And I think the indicator is that if the West can keep firm supporting Ukraine's economy, then it's Russia's that will do the crumbling. The last sort of question here. I mean, you've got under Darth's skin, I would imagine. Following every word that's uttered. Yes, Darth Putin's skin. Putin, the real Putin.
My parody. Yeah.
You've got under his skin by following everything that he says, the speeches, the pronouncements, what is amplified via propagandists. What is your sense of how this regime ends? Is there any flexibility there? Is there any sense in which Putin will say, you know what, we gave it a good run, but hey, let's just go back to where we were before? Or is he incapable of showing weakness? And indeed, does he understand that if he were to show that kind of weakness, he would be finished in Russia anyway, because it's only strength and brutality that keeps you at the top of the pyramid? What's your interpretation of that and of his the limitations of his character?
I don't think that I think he understands full well what will happen to him if he loses this war, or when he loses this war, and what would happen to him if he stopped it. Let's say, for example, a miracle happens and he suddenly decides tomorrow, okay, I'll accept the offer that Trump gave 3 months ago, and I'll get recognition of Crimea from the United States and the territories I've currently occupied, and like that. There's even under that scenario, that there's no chance that Ukraine will give up its long-range strike capability, or accept any limits on the size of its armed forces, or any limits on the type of weapons that they can have. I can imagine under that scenario, the Ukrainians might even consider repursuing non-strategic nuclear weapons. And he can spin that to the Russian people any way he wants. That's not a problem. I think Timothy Snyder said that he can just change the channel on the news, and that's not a problem. It's the hard men he surrounded himself with who'll know that it's complete rubbish, and they will be aware of what was initially demanded back in December 2021, which I think the Kremlin was probably a little surprised they didn't get anything. They just got it all completely dismissed, because I don't think they understand that what they demanded was not something that anybody in the West is able to give them. There's no Western leader that can formally guarantee that Finland and Sweden would never be allowed to join NATO, because that's not how Western institutions work. There's no Western leader that would be able to say that 11 new countries would be kicked out of NATO. They can't force the Ukrainians to accept changes to their sovereignty. They might, at best, have something like what happened at the end of the Second World War, where the Baltic countries, for instance, were never formally recognized as being part of the Soviet Union, but sort of de facto it was. But then as soon as the Soviets collapsed, it's like, well, we never formally recognized this. So those men are going to recognize that this has been a disaster and that they've achieved nothing, and that they've made Ukraine some kind of European version of Israel, a heavily militarized, extremely capable, very angry state, absolutely ruthlessly determined to pursue its own survival by whatever means they feel are necessary, and that no Russian military officer will ever be safe outside of Russia, and possibly not even in Russia ever again. And that's what they've created. and somebody will have to carry the can for that, and it'll be Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin who'll carry that, and he knows it, I think. So he's stuck in a problem of his own making, due to his strategic ineptitude.
And I guess he also knows that he's unlikely to survive that point as well. So this is
the best he could hope for would be what happened to Khrushchev. The best that he could hope for would be what happened to Khrushchev, which would, under very close arrest in some kind of sanatorium stroke dacha somewhere, where it's officially.
But that was possible because Khrushchev was willing to accept those conditions.
Exactly.
He didn't have a choice, but he's not the same kind of thuggish, brutish,
he wasn't
manipulative character.
I've heard his daughter interviewed where his daughter related the story that Khrushchev said, if this is my legacy, then that's great, because you people would have been too terrified to try this with Stalin. So I've improved the country if this is what you're willing to offer me.
Yeah.
Putin, I think, wouldn't be able to live with that kind of humiliation. And whoever succeeds him would know that Putin would always be plotting somehow to try and come back and take and avenge the humiliation. So he would have to go.
Yes, take revenge on the people who impose that kind of restriction on him. I mean, no one would be safe under that scenario.
No.
Will they give him an honorable way out? Will they bring in the tray of sushi and the little pot of tea and the samovar and open all those big windows in the Kremlin and say, Vladimir, this is your choice. This is your
the pistol and the bottle of vodka.
Honor. Yes, or will he really have no choice? He'll be frog marched over to the window of the highest tower and unceremoniously ejected.
I honestly don't know, but I can certainly see a scenario where people are just left saying, pardon the swearing, holy fuck, that's what happened. Okay, that's amazing. They literally chucked him out a window, or they shot him, or he's had a very suspicious accident or something. But I could certainly see that, and it'll be one of those major turning points in modern geopolitical history when it does happen.
Or Rasputin, where they'll poison him, shoot him, drown him, just to make sure, get some garlic and a steak as well.
I think he's definitely very wisely afraid of those things. There was a defector from his protection service who managed to get out of Russia via Kazakhstan and send his family ahead of him, and then disappeared. And he certainly painted a picture of an individual completely paranoid of assassination, and with good reason. You talk about his willingness to escalate. I'm fairly sure that it's been explained to him quite clearly the consequences of escalating to the point of using a nuclear weapon. And I'm seeing a lot less nuclear bluffs. Even Medvedev has made 2 and has been called out for it, even by Donald Trump. And I suspect we might not see any more nuclear bluffs from Medvedev anymore. He's probably been told very clearly, knock it off, Dima, your drunken rants are not helping.
I suspect that the dog doesn't bark unless his chain is yanked. So I suspect that it's not accidental that Dima sobers up and says these things. But what they'll see from that is that, one, it's ineffective. It's not deterring the West from supporting Ukraine, and 2, it's provoked a reaction in Trump, which is not what I think they would have wanted, actually. So I think it's a strategy. And
I think the first Trump administration taught them that it was a bit awkward for them, because suddenly they weren't the craziest one in the room. They had to act like the sensible actor who wasn't able to just be the monkey with the hand grenade, and they didn't like that. So they were, now they're sort of potentially being reminded of it again, and that is something else I've seen from Russian propaganda, is you don't see the same kind of nuclear bluffs of Ukraine has to surrender because we'll nuke you otherwise. That went with the potentially the Ukrainian counteroffensive of 2022 when they blew up the dam. They were trying to pin that on Ukraine, and Russia would never do it. Hang on a minute, Russia was willing to annihilate every living thing on the planet with nuclear weapons, but it won't blow up a dam. They're too nice for that, you fucking idiot. Sorry, I'll probably push you down the algorithm if I swear too much. I can have it bleeped down if you want.
Wasn't in the first 2 minutes. I think we might get away with that. No, exactly. We didn't take them seriously, and we didn't really sort of calibrate the scale of threat. And it remains open, I think, in my mind, whether they would engineer a disaster at a nuclear plant or not. But the tactical nuclear weapons, I think, is off the table. Engineering some plausibly deniable accident, maybe, but that wouldn't necessarily give them any battlefield advantage.
No,
so at this point, I think they're stuck.
I did hear some talk that it had been explained that if you engineer a nuclear meltdown at Zaporizhzhia, we'll hold you responsible, and that'll be the gloves off at that point. So don't think you can get around our bluffs that way either. He's kind of caught in the same situation as he was in December 2021, January 2022, where he had bluffed and demanded so much that he had to go for a full-scale invasion. That he was going to get a massive amount of sanctions if he occupied just the area that Russia already controlled. He was going to get the same sanctions if he occupied, it seems fanciful now, but the people were saying that he'll take the whole of eastern Ukraine up to the river. So why not just go for the whole prize? And make me the greatest Russian leader since whoever it was, Peter the Great.
So that's right. Go for the prize, but also on the belief that Ukraine is weak and divided and as a puppet of the West. So this is going to be a bit of a picnic.
And
of course,
you'll be welcome with bread and salt. Yeah, that was very much his bluff there, having bluffed and threatened and said that Russia was facing an existential crisis. He had no choice, which is why I was a little bit ahead of the game than a lot of people were saying. This war is going to come, because it'd be just too personally humiliating to think that he backed off because senile, sleepy Joe Biden threatened him, and now he's in the same situation again, and I have no sympathy for him.
No, this is not going to end well for him, and I think that day will be a day of celebration and rejoicing. For now, though, Darth, thank you so much for coming back on.
No, I really appreciate the offer. Please remain a master strategist.